In the autumn of 1095, a pope stood in a field in southern France and said something so incendiary, so electrifying, that it would set the entire Western world on fire. What followed was not just a military campaign. In the autumn of 1095, a pope stood in a field in southern France and said something so incendiary, so electrifying, that it would set the entire Western world on fire. What followed was not just a military campaign. It was a convulsion, a rupture in the fabric of medieval society that would send hundreds of thousands of people marching toward a city most of them had never seen, across terrain most of them could not name, against enemies most of them did not understand, and for a staggering number of them it would be a death sentence. But before we get to the mud, the blood, and the catastrophic miscalculations, we need to understand what lit the fuse. Because the First Crusade did not begin on a battlefield. It began with a speech. By 1095, Pope Urban II had a problem. Several problems, in fact. The Church was locked in a bitter power struggle with the Holy Roman Emperor over who got to appoint bishops, a conflict historians call the investiture controversy, and which had been poisoning European politics for decades. Urban himself had been driven out of Rome by a rival pope, an anti-pope, backed by imperial muscle, and was essentially governing the Catholic Church from exile. His authority was real but contested, his position precarious. Then, in the spring of 1095, a delegation arrived from Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sent envoys to the Council of Piacenza with a request. The Seljuk Turks had been tearing through Anatolia, modern Turkey, for decades. They had shattered a Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, seized vast swaths of territory, and were now camped uncomfortably close to Constantinople itself. Alexios needed mercenaries, soldiers, help. Urban saw something in this request that Alexios almost certainly did not intend to offer, an opportunity. Urban saw something in this request that Alexios almost certainly did not intend to offer, an opportunity. If Urban could redirect the chronic, exhausting violence of Western European nobility, the feuding, the raiding, the endless petty wars that were bleeding the continent, and point it eastward toward a holy cause, he could accomplish several things at once. He could strengthen ties with the Eastern Church, potentially healing the Great Schism of 1054 that had split Christendom in two. He could reassert papal authority over secular lords by positioning himself as the supreme commander of a divinely sanctioned enterprise. And he could, with one masterstroke, transform the Pope from a man in exile into the spiritual general of all Christendom. In November 1095, Urban convened the Council of Clermont in what is now the Auvergne region of France. Church business was conducted indoors, but on the final day, the 27th of November, Urban moved outside. The crowds were too large for any building. Thousands of clergy and lay people gathered in a frostbitten field, and the Pope began to speak. We do not have his exact words. Several accounts survive, written by chroniclers who were either present or claimed to be, and they differ significantly. But the thrust of the message is consistent across all versions, and it is astonishing in its audacity. Urban told his audience that the people of the East, Christians, were being persecuted, that the holy city of Jerusalem, the city of Christ's death and resurrection, was in the hands of Muslims who defiled its sacred sites, that it was the duty, not the suggestion, the duty of every able-bodied Christian knight to take up arms, march east, and reclaim it, and that any man who died on this journey would receive full remission of his sins. A one-way ticket, as it were, straight past purgatory. The crowd erupted. According to the chronicler Robert of Rheims, the response was immediate and thunderous, Deus Vult. God wills it. The chant rolled through the crowd like a wave, and Urban, whether he had planted it or simply ignited it, let it burn. Within months, the cross, a strip of cloth sewn onto a tunic, had become the most sought-after symbol in Western Europe. Men and women were reportedly branding crosses into their own flesh in their fervor, The machinery of crusade was in motion. But here is the thing about machinery. Sometimes it moves faster than the engineers intend. The official departure of the crusading armies was set for August 1096. The great lords needed time to raise funds, settle their estates, recruit knights, and organize supply chains. Urban had thought this through, at least partially. What he had not accounted for was a wandering preacher from Amiens named Peter. Peter the Hermit was, by all accounts, an extraordinary figure. Filthy, charismatic, riding a donkey, and absolutely convinced of his divine mission. He had allegedly attempted a pilgrimage to Jerusalem before and been turned back or mistreated, though the details are murky. What is not murky is his effect on crowds. He moved through France and the Rhineland like a human wildfire, preaching the crusade to anyone who would listen, and vast numbers did. What assembled around Peter was not an army in any useful sense of the word. It was a mob. Tens of thousands of people. Peasants, minor clergy, women, children, the elderly, the desperately poor, the desperately devout, gathered under his banner and began marching east in the spring of 1096, months before the scheduled departure. They had little food, no coherent military structure, and an almost entirely fantasy-based understanding of what lay between them and Jerusalem. They were not entirely passive, however. As this ragged host moved through the Rhineland, something horrifying occurred. Jewish communities in the Rhine Valley, in cities like Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, were massacred. The reasoning, such as it was, followed a grotesque logic. If the Crusaders were marching to avenge the suffering of Christians at the hands of unbelievers, why march all the way to Jerusalem when there were Jews living right here? The massacres, known as the Rhineland Pogroms, killed thousands of Jewish men, women, and children. Some bishops tried to shelter Jewish communities. Most failed. It was among the first of many atrocities this movement would generate, and it happened before a single crusader had left Europe. The People's Crusades staggered through Hungary and into Byzantine territory, leaving a trail of looting and chaos behind them. Alexios, who had asked for mercenaries and received what must have looked to him like an invading plague of peasants, rushed them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia as quickly as possible, presumably so they would stop pillaging his own cities. In Anatolia, they were slaughtered. The Seljuk Turks near Nicaea encountered this disorganized mob and destroyed it with almost contemptuous efficiency. In October 1096, at a place called Sivatot, the crusading rabble was ambushed and cut apart. Thousands were killed. Thousands more were enslaved. Peter the Hermit survived. He had conveniently returned to Constantinople before the massacre and would later attach himself to the main crusading force. But his movement was over. The bones of his followers would bleach on the Anatolian plain for years. It was a catastrophe. It was also, in a grim way, a preview. When the official crusading armies finally assembled and departed in the summer and autumn of 1096, they were a different beast entirely. These were led by some of the most powerful nobles in Western Europe, and understanding why they went tells us as much about medieval society as it does about medieval faith. The first and most obvious answer is the one Urban intended: genuine religious conviction. And we should not dismiss this. The medieval Catholic understanding of sin, purgatory, and damnation was not metaphorical. It was as real and immediate to an 11th century knight as the sword on his belt. The idea that a single act of holy warfare could wipe clean a lifetime of violence, adultery, theft, and worse, that was not a small offer. It was the most consequential transaction imaginable. For men who had spent their lives doing terrible things, and most of the nobility had, the crusade was an extraordinary bargain. Jerusalem itself carried an almost supernatural weight in the medieval imagination. This was not simply a city. It was the navel of the world, the place where heaven and earth had most directly intersected, where Christ had died and risen, where the final drama of human history was expected to play out. To walk its streets, to touch its stones, to liberate it. For a deeply faithful person, this was not an adventure. It was an act of cosmic significance. But faith alone does not explain everything. Medieval historians have long wrestled with the more earthly motivations tangled up in the crusading enterprise, and the picture is not flattering. Land hunger was real and structural. Western European inheritance customs, particularly primogeniture, the practice of leaving everything to the eldest son, meant that younger sons of the nobility often found themselves with good breeding, expensive training, and no estate. The Crusade offered the possibility of carving out territory in the east, and several of its leaders did exactly that. Bohemond of Taranto, one of the most militarily gifted commanders of the entire campaign, was the son of a Norman adventurer and had no significant inheritance. His ambitions were not subtle. He ended up as Prince of Antioch. The Crusade, for men like him, was an opportunity dressed in religious clothing. Adventure and glory cannot be discounted either. The warrior culture of the medieval nobility ran on reputation. Heroic deeds, epic struggles, enemies worthy of the steel. These were the currencies of aristocratic identity. Jerusalem was the ultimate stage. To fight, there was to participate in the greatest story in the world, to earn a place in chronicles and songs that would outlast any earthly kingdom. And then there was social pressure. Once the great lords began taking the cross, the calculus shifted for those around them. To stay home while your peers, your rivals, your social superiors marched to the holy city that carried its own costs. Accusations of cowardice, of impiety, of weakness. The crusade was partly voluntary and partly a social trap, and many men walked into it because the door had been built around them. The four main armies that departed in 1096 were led by men who embodied this mix in different proportions. Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, sold and mortgaged much of his estate to fund his journey, a man whose faith appears to have been entirely genuine. Raymond of Saint-Gilles, Count of Toulouse, was the wealthiest of the leaders, and brought his wife and child, apparently intending never to return to Europe at all. Bohemond of Taranto, as noted, had his eye on a principality. Hugh of the Mandois, brother of the King of France, brought mainly his prestige and not nearly enough soldiers. Together, these armies, numbering perhaps 60 to 70,000 people, soldiers and non-combatants combined, began to converge on Constantinople, where a deeply anxious Byzantine emperor was already regretting that he had ever asked for help. He had asked for a few thousand mercenaries. What arrived on his doorstep was the medieval West, in all its violence, its faith, its greed, and its terrifying disorganized momentum. The crusade was coming. And not even God could be certain how this was going to end. Next episode, the armies reach Constantinople and immediately begin threatening to sack it.